I am a crime reporter, and my archives contain exclusively important, mostly secret cases that you won't read about in newspapers or magazines. Just like you won't read about those who solved these crimes. Today, I will tell you about one such mysterious and highly unusual case that occurred in 1967. A strange delegation arrived at one of Leningrad's police departments. Distinguished professors with thick briefcases and horn-rimmed glasses, looking as if they were attending a scientific conference rather than visiting the criminal investigation department. The institute's lecturers were in a panic. A third-year student, one Igor Ipatov, had disappeared. He seemed to have vanished within the walls of his own university. They searched everywhere. They scoured lecture halls, checked offices and dormitories, but he had been nowhere to be found for a whole week. The eccentric professors presented the police with the most incredible theories, from alien abduction to translocation into another informational space. At the time, no one suspected that this story would become one of the most terrifying student horror tales, and that only true professionals would be able to unravel this tangled web of mysteries. They are the heroes of my detective story today. Nikolai Osipov, a 40-year-old criminal investigator, was calm, taciturn, and extremely precise. Vasily Kulichkov, head of the Internal Affairs Directorate, remained an operative at heart and considered this case one of the most fascinating. Pyotr Vaganov, a young inspector at the time, carried out one of the most delicate tasks in the investigation. So the year is 1967. The world watches the space race with bated breath. The Soviet Venera 4 station plunges into the atmosphere of Earth's boiling sister, while the American one only managed to fly by. Each new success strengthens faith in the omnipotence of science. At the same time, the summer of love dawns on the planet. The hippie era flourishes. Long hair, bright shirts, drugs, and rock and roll become symbols of a new generation. But that's overseas. In the USSR, other changes are afoot. Yuri Andropov heads the KGB. From this moment on, the powerful structure becomes all-powerful, beginning to control every Soviet citizen. However, even the omnipotent state security organs would be unable to find an ordinary Leningrad student. It wouldn't be supermen from the committee, but ordinary scoff detectives who would succeed. Leningrad, winter 1967. Leningrad detectives took on the missing person case, which initially seemed quite simple to them. No one doubted that the young man would be found alive and well. Where indeed could a student disappear to? Perhaps he went home? But his parents, who lived in the Tver region, were alarmed. Maybe he went on an internship, and the dean's office forgot to note it in the documents? But this version also failed, as the institute told the detectives, "What internship? It's exam season." Now this piqued the policeman's interest. A hypothesis arose. Perhaps Igor Ipatov deliberately disappeared during the exam period? Oh, those exams. I remember how, twice a year at my university, the most dreadful time for students would arrive. Exam season. The things we did to pass our exams successfully. There were many methods. For example, at midnight before an exam, the gradebook would be placed on the windowsill, and we'd shout out, "Good luck, come to me." Another favorite method, placing a notebook with lecture notes under the pillow at night, assuming that knowledge would transfer to the brain during sleep, probably through diffusion. Although, to be honest, after this, the lecture notes often looked unsightly, and knowledge for some reason didn't increase. Some free riders would pretend to be doctors, get a medical certificate, and then take their exams after everyone else. Teachers were much more lenient with sick students and hardly troubled them. And so, perhaps Ipatov had cleverly hidden somewhere during the exams and would soon reappear with a certificate for a severe but short illness. But this version also failed. According to his classmates, Ipatov, an excellent student, was never afraid of exams. So where is he? The detectives understood. It was time to take serious measures. Ipatov was missing without a trace. The Leningrad police were put on alert. The search included morgues, hospitals, even mental asylums. Everything was checked, but there were no traces of the student. Sometimes it began to seem that he had indeed been abducted by aliens. But at that moment, something strange happened. Almost every day, Igor Ipatov's mother called the police. The anxious woman inquired about the progress of the search and even came to Leningrad specifically. Sympathetic faculty members temporarily housed her in a separate room in the student dormitory, and then one morning, the woman suddenly burst into the detective's office. She was hard to recognize. "I saw Igor," she announced. "He was descending from the heavens." The detectives froze. Perhaps grief had driven the mother mad? But she insisted. Igor was wearing a blue jacket she would recognize among a million, and his favorite trousers. Her son had materialized out of thin air in front of her window, then jumped to the ground and disappeared into the darkness. Was it a ghost, or was someone deliberately trying to drive the woman to a mental hospital? And it was not out of the question that this someone was involved in her son's disappearance. That night, an ambush was set up in the dormitory room. As the mother reported, the ghost usually appeared after midnight. Midnight struck, and suddenly a rustle was heard outside the window, followed by the appearance of legs and boots. Eventually, a young man appeared before the astonished detective's eyes. He hung sadly outside the window, swaying gently, then twitched and fell down. In that same second, everyone was stunned. The operatives rushed outside. The night ghost was apprehended right under the window. He hadn't managed to get far. When they shone a flashlight on the face of the one who descended from the heavens, he was immediately recognized. It was Genka Dyatlov, the missing man's friend. But for some reason, he was wearing Igor Ipatov's clothes. Student Dyatlov himself was surprised by the appearance of the detectives and immediately began to make excuses. As it turned out, Genka hadn't even suspected that he had terribly frightened his friend's mother. He had simply climbed down from the dormitory window on bed sheets. He did this almost every night. A few words about student dormitories. In my opinion, they have hardly changed in the last half-century. Perhaps rooms used to house 10 people, and now 2, each with a laptop or iPad. But everything else remains the same. A tiny stipend, which roommates lived it up on for the first week. The rest of the time, they sucked their paws together until someone brought bags of groceries from their parents. But how much fun! Sometimes 20 people, girls, guys, would cram into one room and make noise until morning. Naturally, they drank more than just milk. It was only bad for those whose girlfriend was in another dormitory. Stern matrons locked the door at 11 in the evening. But could students be contained? They climbed out of windows using fire escapes, drain pipes, and sometimes just bed sheets, just to sneak out on a date. And as it turned out, Genka Dyatlov ran to his girlfriend almost every night, climbing down from the dormitory window on bed sheets. But why in Igor Ipatov's jacket and trousers? The student explained simply. It was a common practice in the room. Everyone socialized, exchanged clothes and shoes. Everyone socialized. So, the night ghost turned out to be the love-struck Genka Dyatlov, and this discovery didn't move the detectives even a millimeter closer to solving Igor Ipatov's disappearance. And suddenly, new information. One of the missing student's classmates remembered seeing Ipatov shortly before they started looking for him. Another ghost? But this time, the young man provided very important information. Igor Ipatov's classmate had gone to the Veliky Luki district to bury his grandmother and met Igor at the train station. Igor said, "I came here on my own business." So, Igor didn't disappear in Leningrad, but in Veliky Luki? The Leningrad detectives immediately forwarded all materials to their colleagues in the Pskov region. Vasily Stepanovich Kulichkov recalls, the Pskov detectives immediately convened an emergency meeting. They were deciding the main question. What business could Igor Ipatov have in Veliky Luki? Did he come to visit relatives? But they all lived far from there. Maybe Igor came to see his beloved girlfriend? Here, things got much hotter. As the student's friends said, he indeed had a sweetheart, Galia Guldyeva. Galina was a brave, lively, energetic girl. Men loved such women at that time. The only thing was, the girl studied with Igor in Leningrad, and her mother and father lived in Veliky Luki. Perhaps Igor went to her parents to propose. After all, he adored his beloved, and was already dreaming of marriage. Their relationship was very good. Igor loved Galina. Many of you probably remember from films how matchmaking, svatovstvo, took place in our Rus. It's a very nerve-wracking custom for the bride's relatives. A white tablecloth, the best dishes, and the bride must be praised. What if the matchmakers don't like her? There was nothing like that in the USSR anymore, but the custom of meeting the parents remained. A respectable groom was simply obliged to appear before the bride's mother and обязательно with a bouquet. At the same time, it was better to look your best. Otherwise, they couldn't forbid the marriage, of course. But after the wedding, dissatisfied relatives would definitely make life difficult. Therefore, it was better to make the most positive impression even before the wedding. Kulichkov immediately sent operatives to Galina's parents. They didn't find the woman at home, but they met the girl's father, Mikhail Gultyaev, and he reported very important news. He said that Igor had come, but had left, and where he went was unknown. So the thread broke. Igor's traces were lost again. Where did he disappear? Why didn't he return to Leningrad? Could the young man have fallen into the hands of some local villains? The policeman didn't like this turn of events. In those days, people walked freely on the streets at night. Kulichkov understood. Several months had already passed since the student's disappearance, so there was almost no hope that he was still alive. The operatives were preparing for the worst. If someone, somewhere discovered the body of a young man, they were to take no action but immediately report to the duty officer. An operational group would be dispatched. Volunteers also helped, and one of the first to volunteer to search for the missing student was his uncle. He had connections with the police and understood the specifics. Volunteers combed ravines and woodlands but found nothing suspicious. And suddenly the phone rang at the police station. A terrified woman was sobbing on the line. Amidst the screams, the policeman barely managed to make out, "She brought a head." The woman went out into the yard, called her dog, and in response, her dog's howl. "What's wrong? Is he cold or something?" The woman wondered and opened the door. She glanced at the porch and screamed in horror. A human skull lay at the dog's feet. By the time the operatives arrived, the owner of the house was in an incoherent state, merely pointing a finger at the doghouse. Soon, both the dog and its gruesome prey were retrieved from there. By all indications, the dog had dug the skull out from somewhere underground. As the owner reported, her four-legged guard often ran into the nearby forest. Obviously, that's where it had dug up the grim grave. The first thought, could this be all that remained of the unfortunate student? And who else could it be, since no one else was being searched for in Velikiye Luki? The gruesome find was immediately taken to the forensic experts. And here, a surprise awaited the detectives. The experts, just by looking at the skull, immediately declared, "This is not your student." The Uskova land groaned. A fascist horde burst upon us, trampled our native fields. These lines by Pskov poet Ivan Vinogradov are dedicated to the war. In those terrible years, the occupiers burned about 4,000 Pskov villages, destroyed more than 7,000 civilians, and deported more than 150,000 people to other zones. But not only German soldiers, they themselves perished here. Practically every district in the Pskov region had German cemeteries. The Germans buried their own neatly, in coffins, each with a dog tag. But for many years after the war, makeshift graves were also discovered. Once, during the excavation of a foundation pit, a German motorcycle with a crew of 3 was found. Apparently, they were buried by an explosion. And even in our time, nameless graves are found in the Pskov forests. Sometimes search parties visit, sometimes black diggers, trophy hunters, and sometimes curious forest animals or dogs. Experts stated the skull found in the forest had lain in the ground for at least 25 years, and most likely belonged to one of the German soldiers. The Pskov detectives realized they would have to start the search all over again. Kulichkov's professional intuition told him it was better to start from the very beginning, that is, with the missing student's fiancée, Galina. The girl had behaved very strangely during the investigation. It seems she wasn't so much worried about her missing fiancé as she was hiding something. Galia became withdrawn, said nothing, and started writing complaints against the officers. The students couldn't say anything special about Galina, just a girl like any other. Perhaps her relatives could provide some interesting information. Kulichkov decided to personally visit Galina's aunt. It turned out she liked to drink. Kulichkov took a bottle of vodka, some snacks, and went to her. An evening of sitting with the Gultyov's elderly relative. Kulichkov began to cautiously ask the woman about Galina. The unexpected happened. The aunt jumped up, waved her arms, rushed to the icons, and whispered, "They are a devilish family." Kulichkov became wary. What did that mean? And the elderly woman spoke in riddles. Allegedly, several years ago, Galina's father had stayed at her house, and she had seen the terrible things they were doing. She had to sprinkle the house with holy water. Kulichkov couldn't get anything more coherent out of her. What devilish deeds? What had frightened the father and daughter's relatives so much? Obviously, something was going on with them, and something very creepy. Kulichkov decided to place all members of the family under covert surveillance. Galina, her mother, she worked as a cook in a canteen, and Mikhail Gultyaev. Although deep down, the detectives were very doubtful about the possible involvement of the head of the family in this case. This man, an officer of the Soviet Army, a war veteran, made too good an impression on everyone. Covert surveillance began, but days, weeks passed, and the devilish family showed no suspicious behavior. Another false lead, and the aunt's speculations about terrible pranks were just fantasies. But then the detectives got unexpectedly lucky. A home telephone appeared in the Gultyev's apartment. It's hard to imagine that in our parents' time, there were not only no mobile phones, but home telephones were also an incredible rarity. Widespread telephone installation only began in the mid-60s, but back then, people stood in line for a telephone for more than 15 years. This was longer than the queues for apartments. By the way, somewhere at my home on the shelves, I still have the first telephone set. On the dial, besides numbers, there were also letters. This was so that if it was difficult to remember someone's number, you could imagine, for example, a 245. Letters next to numbers were used in the USSR until 1968. For the KGB, as well as for the Criminal Investigation Department, the appearance of telephones in apartments also became a convenient detail because now they could eavesdrop on suspects. Soon, all conversations between Gultyaeva's wife and her daughter were recorded. And one day, the detectives heard an important phrase, "Run, daughter, they might detain you." Kulichkov understood. He needed to act without delay. He urgently summoned the young operative Vaganov and gave an order. Immediately bring the missing young man's fiancée, Galina Gultyeva. When the operative was sent to Leningrad, he was given clear instructions. When you get on the train, hold her hand and don't let go until you bring her to Velikiye Luki. The operative spent the night with Galina 40 years ago. Only that night was a real ordeal and shock for him, a young operative. No wonder he was sent alone for a dangerous suspect. At the station, Vaganov took out the tickets and discovered with horror there were still 3 whole hours until the train departed. What to do? Stand on the platform with the girl, clinging to her hand? He had to go to the cinema. In the cinema, Pyotr felt extremely awkward. Such a pretty girl, such a wonderful movie, and you're holding her like a prisoner. He got embarrassed and gently let go of her hand. Let her watch a good movie freely, especially since maybe she wasn't a criminal, just a suspect for now. Vaganov didn't even suspect. The hardest ordeal was still ahead. Already on the train, in the carriage it turned out. The compartment was a 2-seater. The young operative was taken aback. He hadn't even suspected such a thing existed. You've traveled in compartment carriages more than once, right? Better than in open-plan carriages, at least there's a door. And did you know that in old carriages, the most prestigious compartment was the first one, right behind the wall from the conductor's compartment? This compartment was intended for special services. Vaganov lingered near the compartment, making all sorts of colorful assumptions. What if Galina started undressing before bed? What if the pretty suspect seduced him? There was no way out. He had to travel together. And so he delivered the suspect to Veliky Luki safe and sound. There, Galina was immediately sent for a medical examination. Within a couple of hours, the results were known. She had even given birth. The results of the medical examination shocked the detectives. Galina Gultieva, a Komsomol member, an athlete and an activist, was hiding her children somewhere. Yes, it turned out, and not just one. And now perhaps I will touch upon a topic that is not usually discussed, but believe me, it was very important for the youth of that time. Chastity was valued for a very long time. I myself read that during the height of the war, a German doctor examining girls aged 16 to 20 who had been deported from the USSR to Germany was extremely surprised. He was struck that 90% of the prisoners were virgins. He even wrote to Hitler that it was impossible to defeat a people with such high morality. And indeed, it was a far cry from having ice cream in a cafe back then. If a girl married chaste, I think modern teenagers perceive all this as a fairy tale. But that's how everyone lived then. The Pskov detectives pondered, where did such a young girl, a student, get such a turbulent past? Could it have been the reason for her fiancé's disappearance? Perhaps he found out? Galina remained silent. The Pskov detectives had no more grounds to detain her, so they decided to release her, but to watch her closely. What if she led them to Igor Ipatov's possible murderers? Galina immediately left for Leningrad. From the dormitory, only to the institute, no suspicious men around. And only a few days later, her father, Mikhail Gultyaev, visited her. The father and daughter went for a walk in a nearby park with an operative. The policeman was bored. Nothing interesting, just ordinary family conversation. He didn't even notice how, on a deserted alley, the father moved behind his daughter and, distracting her with conversation, took a strong cord out of his pocket, raised his hands to throw it around Galina's neck, and suddenly a passerby appeared on the path. Mikhail Gultyaev flinched, hid the cord in his pocket. The father and daughter walked on, but there was no suitable moment. The Pskov detectives would learn about this murder attempt a little later. But then in February 1969, Kulichkov decided to detain Gultyaev for a completely different reason. Kulichkov received operational information from maternity hospitals where he had sent inquiries about Galina Gultyaeva. He was trying to track down where the girl had received medical assistance regarding possible childbirths. And this information plunged the detective into genuine shock. These were not births. These were late-term abortions. But the most horrific thing, by whom? By her own father. She had abortions twice. One abortion was performed in the city of Mary. The father arranged everything, and the second abortion in Pskov itself. The doctors themselves were shocked, an unheard of situation. The girl was very young. During her first pregnancy, she was only 14. With the second child, 16. The doctors did not suspect that it was the caring father who had brought his pregnant daughter. She got pregnant. This victim of her rapist was covering her tracks. This incredibly convoluted case is most vividly etched in memory by the scene of Mikhail Gultyev's arrest. He was ready to withdraw money from his savings book, more than 10,000 rubles, and flee. He was already 1 foot out the door. Only a trifle remained: to check out of the apartment. The former officer entered the passport office of the housing department and froze in astonishment. Instead of the passport officer, Detective Kulichkov was sitting at the desk. In his hands, an arrest warrant. He was arrested and charged with cohabiting with his underage daughter and, out of jealousy, murdering her fiancé, Ipatov. Galina's father was simply stunned. He was enraged, threatening the detectives and the KGB for arresting a war veteran. Then, reconsidering, he decided to offer a bribe of 10,000 rubles. But Kulichkov was adamant. All that remained for him was the most difficult part: to find where the murderer had hidden the remains of the unfortunate student. A search was conducted in the house, and a bone and a watch belonging to Igor were found. Seeing the photographs from his own basement, Gultyev broke down and began to tell the truth. For the first 13 years after Galina's birth, Mikhail Gultyev was a positive husband and father. But one fateful day, everything changed. He turned into a scoundrel, but he didn't consider himself one. He even found a noble explanation. Supposedly, his daughter needed sex for her health. Allegedly, a doctor once casually remarked, "When she starts living with a man, then this illness of hers will pass." Little Galia was only 12. She understood nothing. And then she simply didn't know how to escape from her rapist father. After all, even her own mother couldn't help her. Only once did her own aunt guess what was happening to the unfortunate child. But instead of helping the girl, she only saved herself from terrifying visions with holy water. Galia loved the young man, was shocked, but as it turned out, he truly loved his Galia and decided to deal with her abuser like a man. He came to Gultyev's house and announced from the threshold, "I know everything about you." The rapist understood. There was no way out, and he hit Igor with an iron. And then, over several days, he dismembered the corpse and burned it in the furnace. Kulichkov couldn't understand how a war veteran could commit such atrocities. Out of lust, he forever broke his little daughter's life and cut her only love into pieces. Are men who went through the war capable of this? Kulichkov himself had reached Berlin. He knew veterans are distinguished by their crystal honesty. Only later did the secret come to light. During the investigation, it turned out, Gultyev was not a war hero at all. The documents were forged. Galina's father was a traitor and had served the Germans. During the war years, Gultyev tortured and killed his countrymen, and after the victory, he turned on his daughter and her fiancé. But if he managed to escape retribution during the war years, he couldn't in peacetime. The scoundrel got what he had long deserved, a bullet to the back of the head.